Welcome to this innovation and engagement event on the foundational economy, hosted by the School of Geography and Planning at Cardiff University. Many thanks for making the time to join us. We've got an excellent programme of speakers, as we'll see in a moment. But the theme of the day is really to try to assess where we are and where we think we're going with respect to the foundational economy strategy in Wales. And before we get on to those topics, I thought very briefly in a few minutes, I'd try to reflect on how we've come to be where we think we are at this point. For those not familiar with this story, the short version of it is that it's really an incredible story of how new ideas emerge and travel and move from the academic world into the world of policy and practice. And for those, as I say, who don't know, the story begins, at least in my own understanding of it, in terms of the work of Julie Froud, who's one of our speakers today, with her colleague Carol Williams and others, who developed the concept of foundational economy and disseminated it in very imaginative ways of engaging with the worlds of policy and practice in Wales. For example, their engagement with the FSB, Federation of Small Business, who commissioned some early reports, their engagement with Coastal Housing Group, where Debbie Green, another of our speakers today, is chief executive. These engagements developed some very innovative place-based thinking about how we could really help to renew our places in Wales. Those ideas then became attractive for one reason or another to Welsh Government and National Assembly, as it was then, politicians. And one of the main people who took the ideas up was Lee Waters, who's the third of our speakers today. And because he's not here, I can say this without embarrassing him. Lee has been one of the most consequential politicians that I've personally worked with in 20 years of devolution. He's been honest, frank, and impatient for change, for consequential change, to make things happen. He was one of the first politicians I know anywhere in the United Kingdom who said, we don't have a plan. We don't know where we're going. We're building the road as we travel, as the Basques famously say. And he nearly got sacked for that. Under any other First Minister, in my view, he would have got sacked for that. But Mark Drakeford took a charitable view of Lee speaking the truth. So as a result of Lee Waters and others, we've had the Foundational Economy Challenge Fund, funded by Welsh Government, which, as some of you know, some of you will be beneficiaries of it, funded some 52 projects on local development, where localities themselves chose the theme. They chose procurement, they chose food, they chose social care and other topics that they had reason to value, rather than being imposed on them from the outside. More recently, we've seen the Cardiff Capital Region develop its own challenge fund to promote foundational type activities. But the final point I'd want to make before introducing the panel is to say this. Throughout Wales, every organisation has enormous capacity constraints, enormous budgetary constraints as a result of 10 years of austerity and as a result of COVID, for example. And what this means, among other things, I think, is that to try to alleviate and mitigate those capacity constraints, one sure way of doing that is by working in concert to develop real, genuine, meaningful forms of co-production where we literally pool our ideas together. And this is a big challenge for us all, for government to work in new ways, less hierarchical and more partnership working. It's a big challenge for universities who are used to developing and working with narrow frames of development to do with high tech. And it's a challenge also, by the way, I think, for civil society organizations, which don't have the capacity often to engage in these type of schemes. So that's what I think anyway, where we've come from. We're going to assess today where we think we are as our panelists reflect on their own understanding of the foundational economy in Wales to date. And that brings me then to the first of our speakers, who is Debbie Green. As I said earlier, Debbie is Chief Executive of Coastal Housing Group and has been one of the pioneers of trying to put the foundational principles into practice. So without further ado, Debbie, over to you and welcome.
Hello, excuse me, my voice isn't great, which isn't good in these circumstances, but I'll do my best. So thank you very much, Kevin, for that introduction. I kind of always feel when you get a big introduction like that, you're only going to go on and disappoint. So I'll try not to be too disappointing. I tried to think about when I was putting this presentation together, because there's so much ground I could have covered, and I haven't got long. So I tried to think briefly about housing associations and their role, some of the work that housing associations have done supported by the Challenge Fund, but also how housing associations have already been working in the foundation economy. And I've got some sort of concluding thoughts about what that might mean and where next, really, particularly in light of what are going to be very difficult times with constrained resources. And right. Okay, I couldn't get my presentation to move on, but it's speaking to me, so that's good. So very quickly, a little bit about Coastal Housing Group. So we're a community housing association. I think the community focus of housing associations is quite important. We're based in a relatively concentrated geographical area, and as you can see, we're a cooperative and community benefit society. So in a sense, social community focused activity is written into our DNA, and we're quite big economic entities, both in terms of income and the capital program we have. We build a significant number of homes each year with about a £20 million building program, which is very closely linked in with regeneration, community placemaking, and then a whole host of services, which I've only highlighted some of the key ones there. But apart from giving general support to our residents, themes of work in terms of supporting people back into work and a whole host of other specialised support services, plus in terms of a person-based service, very much often with just responding to other resident need. Housing kind of is part of and sits in the foundational economy, I would say, by definition, although until the foundational economy was invented as an economic academic concept, we wouldn't have described ourselves like that. So, you know, housing as a home, not as an investment, but housing as a home is a foundation, is part of the foundational economy. And housing associations contribute across the foundational economy in a whole range of areas, through from construction to health and social care and a myriad of things in between. And we kind of, as anchor organisations, we sit in that space between government and the community. And I think sometimes government could probably recognise that role of us as anchor organisations and lever it a bit more fully. And I'll come on to that a bit more as I go on. And we've got long-term focus. We own housing. We're rooted in the community. We can't up and go anywhere. We're there for life. In terms of the Challenge Fund, that's quite an interesting one when it comes to housing associations. I guess possibly uniquely, we're one of those third sector organisations that whilst nobody is overflowing with funds, we're actually better resourced than quite a lot of other organisations. So significantly, I would say, with more money at our disposal than, for example, local authorities are. The Challenge Fund came along kind of as an experiment by Welsh Government to think about how they could work in the foundational economy differently, what levers they could pull and what things they could invest in that would make the most difference. And housing kind of sits in an interesting space where it's delivering regeneration and social purpose. So it's quite well suited to join down funds in this area. But the economic impact of the sector tends to be less visible to Welsh Government. So normally we're dealing with housing and regeneration. We're not typically seen as a lever for economic intervention, and we don't typically have that much to do with that side of Welsh Government, although we're big economic agents. Nevertheless, there were 4 Challenge Fund projects that were housing association led. So here they are. There was a couple of probably quite discrete projects, really, one looking at smart technology and another one looking at online system developments. I guess the two, I think, that are a bit more interesting, whilst they all have merit, obviously, is one which is around a collaboration between 4 housing associations. And I think collaboration is one of those areas where we could all do more. So I think being able to have funding that supports that collaboration and a more long-term focus. So this is 4 housing associations working up in Blaen y Gwent to map out the supply chain there and how they interacted with it, and then work long-term to build and develop and support that local SME supply chain in the area of Blaen y Gwent is something I think that is much less likely to have happened without funding. And now we have a roadmap for that sort of activity. Hopefully that starts to be an exemplar that other housing associations and indeed other people working locally can follow. And Rhondda Housing Association, which is a smallish housing association, so not necessarily able to identify spare capacity normally to do this sort of thing, but mindful, I think, of some of the other regeneration work that's been done by housing associations, specifically looking at acquiring vacant space in terms of placemaking and thinking about that longer term future for Tonopandi Town Centre, and investing in an enterprise hub, which is also aimed at skills building and revitalising the high street. So again, a longer term intervention that they probably wouldn't have been doing otherwise. So I think just thinking about the learning in terms of the Foundational Economy Challenge Fund, and particularly how government works with housing associations and vice versa, I guess it's pulled housing associations a bit more into that space of economic entity and economic part of Welsh Government. And the funds work well because it recognises the diversity of activities that encompass the foundational economy, which kind of matches how housing associations work. And it's created a space for housing associations to do things that are kind of not so easy as part of the day job. So I think that's kind of the innovation space, really, that the fund has supported. I suppose from Welsh Government perspective, thinking about where best to spend the foundational economy pounds when it comes to housing associations, some of the things I've touched on. I think getting collaboration to work is always difficult, and getting best practice to travel is always difficult. And I think these 2 examples, which are around collaboration either with other housing associations, the supply chain, the local community with a long-term focus, are the sort of things that are particularly interesting in terms of what the Foundational Economy Challenge Fund has supported. Having said that, any sort of funding that's got a short-term focus for organisations that are there for a long term, I think has challenges, and it has tended, if you look at the people who've been successful under the Challenge Funds, to focus on sectors rather than places, or that kind of messy nature of complex systems that come to play within the foundational economy. Probably an exception to that is social care, which I think clearly can be identified as a specific sector. And it kind of assumes money is the answer, and clearly money can be part of the answer, but very often we're also looking at issues around culture, behaviour, structures, governance, and the limits on co-production. And that's both in terms of the people who received the money and Welsh governments. And I guess it will be interesting to see how the community of practice teases out some of those issues. And I think it overlooks the levers in the sense that Welsh government sometimes already does have in terms of when it gives out money. And I guess it's focusing on that particularly around procurement, but there's plenty of other money that Welsh government gives out where it could be a bit more intentional about the levers it pulls. And so, for example, social housing grant that's received by housing associations is a big number, but actually it's handed out with very few strings. I think as well it's worth reflecting a bit on some of the work that housing associations have already been doing, and probably because this just fits naturally with our missions and not necessarily intentionally because we were deciding to intervene in the economy, but just actually because we're rooted in place. Our success and the success of our residents depends on those places functioning and working both from a social infrastructure point of view and in terms of their economic infrastructure. So some of the things that Coastal have been doing, and particularly the former, the work in High Street in Swansea, has been a long-term endeavour, which has been in sort of with strategic support from the council in terms of money, mostly supported by social housing grants and mixed-use housing-led regeneration. In terms of that long-term piece about buying, redeveloping, refocusing and repurposing the High Street in Swansea, which for anyone who knows the High Street in Swansea, I guess you could say it's better than it was. So these interventions take a long time, but it's been around working in a different way as well with the community, identifying different partners. So part of it's around physical assets and part of it is around actually understanding which parts of the community want to engage with the High Street, working differently with the creative industries and the arts community in terms of that regeneration piece. And that fits quite nicely into the foundational economy narrative. Morriston, I think, has been a bit different because that started off with a piece of research. So working with Manchester University Business School to try and understand Morriston from a foundational economy perspective. For those who don't know it, Morriston's got a very long high street, which is doing relatively well in terms of the fact that it hasn't got that many empty properties in it, but they're not, I guess, in the most exciting areas of retail, and it's kind of on the cusp of decline rather than anything else. So it's sort of capturing that high street at a point in time and trying to think about how that can be repurposed. But the research was very much engaging with the local community in terms of what matters to them about their local economy. I think what was one of the things that was interesting is that people responding to that don't really think in those terms. So when they talked about what mattered, they recognised the retail offer of the high street, the availability of job opportunities for younger people, but they also talked a lot about social capital and social infrastructure. So things like libraries, the local park, and the high street as somewhere of community, where a community comes together as much as a place of economic and market transaction. And I think sometimes policymakers overlook that interconnectivity, so that initiatives don't really speak to those wider purposes of places. And where we've had austerity, some of the things that get cut first, things like libraries, looking after local amenities, like parks, actually cut to the heart of how those places work from a foundation economy or community perspective. And on the back of that research and actually working in partnership with the local authority and a whole host of other partners, there's been a working group that's been meeting probably about every 6 weeks for the last couple of years. And some of that has been supported by targeted regeneration investment funding, which is a housing and regeneration capital funding pot. And I think one of the things that's been good about that is both Welsh Government and the local authority have been prepared to use that quite flexibly. It's not huge chunks of money, but it's been able to be flexed to support some of the things that the local retail community want, shop front initiatives that weren't initially within the scheme, green infrastructure, a whole host of things that individually don't sound like much, but when they all come to play in quite a small, discrete area, start to have a impact. And at the same time, there's some housing-led regeneration work being done by Coastal, which is around creating accommodation for key workers and older people in the community looking for probably downsizing, and also, again, reinvigorating some commercial areas. And another thing that housing associations typically are involved in terms of their procurement and their spend for a long time now has been procurement that focuses on social benefits. So where we've had big maintenance improvement programs, those have been focused on how do we get the most community benefit out of that. And again, I think there are some examples of good practice in terms of procurement policy that's happened in housing probably for the last 15 years now, that's not necessarily travelled that well outside of the housing sector. So some closing thoughts, which are around the fact that we've got some wicked problems to solve, and I guess some opportunities as well in terms of the green economic recovery. And as far as housing is concerned, that piece around decarbonisation, retrofit, which actually speaks to environmental, social and economic benefits and sort of is situated in that foundational economy space. High street recovery, again, post-COVID, where I think we've all seen as citizens, we're not just missing, again, the ability to go into towns and shop, which we've managed to do quite well online, but it's that sense of community and coming together in coffee shops or destinations or value-added services that we're missing, and thinking about that more intentionally as we start to move into, eventually at some point, we hope, into some sort of high street recovery where we get back to normal. And thinking about where we're looking to create a well-being economy, and which sits very closely with the foundational economy. For me, as much as anything, it requires thinking differently. That's a whole system collaborative effort. And for me, I think some of the challenges that Kevin touched on at the beginning, really, which are around co-production and how do we rise to these challenges with what are going to be scarce resources, is as much about a change in behaviour and governance and recognising the need to delegate more to local communities and co-produce, which I think the Foundational Economy Challenge Fund has spoken to, but also to recognise maybe more intentionally those organisations that are well placed to move in that space. So housing associations, I think, are good examples of anchored organisations, but they're not the only ones. Kevin, in his introduction, also referred to universities, which are another. And I think a sort of almost a sense of corporate social responsibility amongst our public sector and other local anchored bodies, and being able to work much more agilely together in a way that moves us beyond mechanisms like public service boards, which are a good start, but tend to be bogged down in meetings, to actually realising real change on the ground is the next piece of innovation that we really need to nail. So that's a quick whiz through from me. Thank you for listening. And I think open to questions.
Yeah, so if you've got a question that you would like to ask Debbie, you can type it in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the screen, or you can raise a hand. There's a little way that you can raise a hand and we can just come to you and I'll unmute you. So entirely up to you. Nobody's got any questions yet. Kevin, do you have any questions? Silence.
I would if I could speak, but I was muted, Lucy. So I was chomping at the bit, sorry, to ask
That's
a question.
okay. David Llewellyn's put a question in.
Anyway, no worries. No, while people were thinking of a question, I wanted to say a big thank you to Debbie for that presentation, not least because she raises some of the big issues that we're all collectively trying to deal with, like the fact that the way that development has been thought about in Wales means that some of our biggest, most important players, like housing associations or university health boards, for example, have never been seen as the enormous players that they are. And Welsh Government has been slow, I think, to recognise this. When you think of the multiple benefits that housing associations like Coastal can play, not just in terms of housing and development, but as Debbie said, in terms of procurement, culture change, welfare policy, and so on and so forth. So Debbie, I wonder whether you would say that the Foundational Economy Challenge Fund, modest as it is in financial terms, helps us to think about reframing the way we think about place-based development and allows bodies like yourselves to play a bigger role, because being an economic anchor doesn't really do justice to all the multiple benefits that you deliver.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And in fairness, it's easy to point the finger at Welsh Government, but I think as a sector, we probably could point it at ourselves as well in terms of how we think about ourselves and have we stretched ourselves to be as ambitious as we could be. And I think collaboration is a space where we could all say we could do more as well. I think it's been interesting because I'm chairing the Welsh Government Foundation Economy Task and Finish group to see that, as that's progressed, it's been talking more and more closely to colleagues in housing and regeneration, recognising that some of the big initiatives that are hopefully going to take us through into 2021, like green economic recovery, speak across all those social economic skills, foundational economy spaces. And I think I've seen a change there in terms of the conversations between colleagues within Welsh Government. But I think, and whether it's because the evolution in Wales is still relatively new, it feels to me for a small country, we really are quite centralised. And there's something about, the sort of slightly uneasy relationship between Welsh Government, regional groupings and local authorities. So we do have a plethora of organisations that are quite confusing to work with sometimes, and maybe not an agile enough way of getting money out of Welsh Government to someone else who's able to experiment with it a bit more quickly.
So we have actually got some questions, Kevin. Do you want me to read them out? There's two questions in the Q&A. So the first one's from David Llewellyn, and he says, how well are you linked with the Health Board Wellbeing Economy?
So I think I can only speak for health boards in the area in which I work, and health boards clearly at the moment especially have got their own issues in the middle of a health pandemic. But I think culturally as well, they're not that attuned to working collaboratively with smaller organisations, and I just think that's kind of a nature of their history and the way they've developed. The public service boards, I guess, is the first step towards trying to create an easier interface, but housing associations aren't statutory bodies on public service boards, so they may or may not find themselves on one, but that's more by the good grace of the convening public service board than any right to be there. And I think there are still some huge untapped opportunities for health, but some of them I think are more around actually if you're in the business of offering kind of reactive health care, then it's quite hard for health bodies to move into that space and investing in more proactive well-being, because it's still coming from the same budget. So it feels like possibly government needs to work a bit more with those health boards to think about how the money is given out, because otherwise it's very difficult to see what the levers for change are, even though it's intellectually obvious we should be in a space where we're working more collaboratively around preventative health. There's an awful lot of barriers to make that happen.
Okay, thank you. I've got two people who'd actually like to, they've raised their hands. So the first is Kay Powell. I'm going to press to allow you to talk. Do you want to ask your question, Kay?
Thank you. I think my question has changed several times through the discussion, but I was really interested in what Debbie was saying and the need for a recognition from all the players, really, that this is a lot about people as well as organisations, and learning to operate more flexibly. It's quite tricky, because every organisation has its fundamental tasks to deliver. But I just thought that from the perspective of Debbie, your role, are there any key pointers that you really think could make a big difference in the next 5 years? What really could make this difference? Is it something like a series of good practice examples coming out, and perhaps more in terms of a video rather than using the technology that we're now all getting used to, rather than endless reports or meetings, as you've said, the public service boards get involved in. Are there some key pointers that you feel that really could take this collaborative agenda forward?
I think, yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's something about, I mean, from organisational terms, as an analogy in my organisation, we kind of talk about leaders getting out and understanding what's going on the front line, and then designing our services from that perspective, rather than sitting in an office writing a strategy. And I guess that analogy applies equally well, in a sense, to some policy making initiatives. I think it's been said often enough that we have a plethora of excellent policies in Wales, but struggle a bit more around the delivery. And I think some of that is sometimes, I think the foundation economy is a good example of where Welsh Government has done really well in terms of embracing it as a concept and trying to push it forward, but there are limits to what Welsh Government can do by itself. But we tend to sit in Welsh Government talking to ourselves about what's not working, rather than getting out and trying to talk to the community about what it looks like from their perspective. So there's just something about actually getting out maybe from government and going and sitting in some of those community groups and just listening to people, because those sort of normative experiences are really meaningful, I think. And there's something about organising around the work as well, so that whilst we've got the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, which I think foundational economy sits within very well, actually we've still got quite conventional departmentalised working in Welsh governments, and I appreciate changing around departmental structure is really difficult, but if the fundamental themes are that kind of interconnectivity between well-being, social infrastructure, economic infrastructure, inequality, it doesn't feel like our design of the work or the policy making fits that, where actually everything now seems to be a cross-cutting theme. So I think people actually having some really good videos is helpful, because it's that kind of qualitative live case study, but I think some profound, probably behavioural and structural change as well.
Thanks very much.
Debbie.
Super.
I'm afraid we need to move on now, folks. We're capturing all the discussion in the chat and the questions, and our panel will reply to every question. I guarantee that. But we really need to move on, because we're falling behind with time. Debbie, many, many thanks for that full and frank presentation and for answering questions. in an equally full and frank manner. We move on now to Professor Julie Froud. Julie, as I said earlier, is one of the original architects, along with Carol Williams and colleagues, of the concept of foundational economy, and she's been one of the key players in the evolution and developing this concept up until now. So without further ado, Julie, over to you.
Okay, Julie's just asked me to unmute her. I've sent you a request to
There
unmute.
we are. That's working now.
Thanks, Julie.
I'm used to too much online teaching, you see. I'm used to being in charge of everything. It's very hard when you can't control things. So I'm now going to share my screen. So I hope everybody can see that.
Yep.
Okay, great. Let me just get rid of the little pictures. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation. I haven't spoken to Debbie before this event to compare notes, but actually lots of the things Debbie has said are things actually I'm going to talk about as well. So I think there's going to be quite a nice coherence here. So I'm going to talk about the foundational economy and think about sort of where we're up to in our thinking about the foundational economy. And I've kind of termed this in shorthand, it's collective work in progress. It's definitely work in progress because the thinking is evolving. And it's also collective because this is such a sort of an important and complex set of ideas that it's not about one person or one group. It's really about how lots of us come together and develop that knowledge in a collective way. So I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to focus on the idea of the foundational economy as both about thinking and also about doing. So I want to think about what's the foundational economy, how does it fit in with our current concerns about COVID-19, climate emergency, well-being of future generations. Then I want to think about, how do we implement a kind of foundational way of thinking? What are the constraints around that? And thirdly, come to the Challenge Fund. So the Challenge Fund is clearly very important because we hope it's a very progressive intervention. It opens up all kinds of possibilities for social innovation, but it's yet something that's, something that could achieve lots of positive outcomes, but I think there's some way to go in terms of how we understand how we might use these kinds of opportunities. So that's not meant as a criticism of the Challenge Fund, it's more a kind of taking stock of where we're at. Okay, so let's start with what's the foundational economy. So what I'm trying to think about is foundational economy is a kind of shift, represents a shift in how we think about the economy. So not so much think about the economy, think about multiple economies, and also at the same time think about what matters to people in this thing called the economy or the economies. And much of what matters to most of us in our daily lives are what's in boxes 3 and 4 on my slide. So it's the foundational economy of daily necessities and also the core economy. And this is the kind of things that we do with and for each other. And if you think about many activities like care, most care takes place, not in the formal economy in a marketed sense, but in the core economy. So much of what matters to us is in those boxes and often invisible. In formal terms. So if you think about the foundational economy, it's an assembly of socio-technical reliance systems. Much of what we recognize now as the foundational economy was established from the late 19th century through to the middle of the 20th century, and it comprises those those very heavy infrastructures around utilities, food distribution systems, and so on, and also providential systems around health and care. So these are the systems that were put in place to help meet our everyday needs. And clearly, if you think about COVID-19, what that's done in a sense is remind us about the importance of these reliance systems. So the things that we actually need to keep ourselves going on a daily basis. We've seen this kind of new category of key workers used in a very rhetorical sense, though obviously lots of questions about how much we really mean all our warm words for key workers when a lot of their working conditions have not really improved very much as a consequence. And also, interestingly, if you think about the sectors most hard hit by COVID-19, many of those are in the box labelled number 2, the overlooked economy, which is the sort of the bit that sits outside the foundational economy, but is also highly important. This is a lot of hospitality, personal services, and so on is in that box, and also quite often ignored in mainstream economic discourse. So we can think about all of this as maybe it's a bit naff maybe, but we can think about it as this is foundational economy 1.0. Okay, it's the essentials that we have in place. When it works well, it keeps us all safe and civilized. Okay, so it's highly essential, but it also, much of this represents a burden on the planet. So we can't be complacent about it in any way, because these reliance systems don't always work perfectly. They don't provide everybody with their daily needs, but they're also part of the problem. So if we think about how we need to develop our foundational thinking, we need to move beyond foundational economy 1.0 and sort of move to a kind of, the next generation of thinking. And this is important because if we think about the foundational economy in the context of the well-being of future generations, we need to recognise that the foundational economy reliance systems are part of the problem. So there's a number of challenges that we have in terms of, reflecting on the foundational economy in the context of well-being. We need to address the existing reliance systems, particularly around sectors like food, transport and housing, because these contribute large amounts of carbon. So these need decarbonising. We need to think about new kinds of energy. We need to think about, electric vehicles. We need to think about all kinds of developments, all kinds of innovations that are going to improve these existing reliance systems. We need to think about how we collectively rebalance consumption towards low carbon personal services. So think about health, education and care. These are important foundational services and they don't contribute large amounts of carbon emissions. So these are things we could do more of and not damage the well-being of future generations. And we also need to think about how we build new resource and conversion systems. So this sort of ideas are very much based on some recent work that colleagues and myself have been doing on the wood economy in Wales, and trying to think about rebuilding reliance systems around things like wood, renewable energy, because you're not simply producing a product, you're producing something that connects with communities, connects with a range of products and services. So this collectively represents, I guess, what we could call foundational economy 2.0. So now what we need to do is secure these essentials for current generations while also bearing in mind the future generations. So we've got to balance the current and the future generations more effectively. Okay, so that's the what. Now we know what we need to do now is come to the how. So how do we think about rebuilding, renewing the foundational economy, given the many constraints that we have? Okay, now the constraints take various forms. So I want to focus initially on some of the policy and political constraints. Clearly, in terms of politics, we are facing quite a different kind of politics. We've got problems about populism and problems about the extent to which it's much easier to talk in terms of slogans rather than tackle complex problems, and particularly where the problems are about the need to reform things like food systems, transport systems. These are things that are complicated because they require trade-offs and they require quite sophisticated ways of thinking, not superficial ways of thinking. And so that's a big challenge. If we want to renew the foundational economy, we've got to kind of get beyond some of the political problems. And then we've got the problems about delivery. So think about Wales, we've got very complicated multi-level governance. We've got a Welsh government that's good at coming up with strategy. We've got local authorities, as Debbie mentioned, austerity has wreaked huge damage on local authorities over the last decade. We've then got the NHS, we've got the other autonomous institutions, universities, further education, colleges, etc., etc. We've got lots of fragmentation in terms of how do you actually make things happen. And whilst we have a lot of strategy, for example, in coming back to the area of forestry, we've got 20 years of afforestation strategy, but very little actually happening. So how do we move from nice strategies to action? And of course, to have a very unhelpful relationship with Westminster. Then we have problems about administrative capability, the ability to actually do things. And the example here is an English one, and maybe the situation in Wales is not too much different. So think about the area of healthcare. We've had huge amounts of hyper innovation and seemingly endless reorganization, which in effect undermines delivery. So lots of effort is paid into reorganization while capacity gets lost. And to take the example of things like public health laboratories, test and trace systems, we've seen recently that it's very easy for governments to kind of resort to outsourcing as a way to solve problems where domestic capacity has been lost. Okay, so how do we think about the foundational approach? So we can kind of characterize this as, we need careful practice, but we need radical policy. So by careful practice, what I mean is, having some sense by starting without having all the answers clear. And sometimes that's a little bit uncomfortable. So, it's not like we're consultants who have generic fixes and say, this is what you have to do. And similarly, we can't simply be romantics with visions. We've got to have some, we've got to have some modesty about what we can do. And we need to think about, how do we use research? How do we use engagement in communities? How do we understand the importance of different things to different people in order to develop, careful practice that actually can be effective. At the same time, we need to be radical. So we have to transition in ways that are, hard to comprehend, I think, in lots of ways. So we've got to make a difference for many households. We've got to renew our reliance systems and at the same time improve livability. So we're not simply trying to meet the needs of future generations through carbon reduction. We actually need to make substantial improvements in livability for households now. Clearly, this is difficult. We can see in France that attempts to kind of do the right thing in one sense leads to populist backlash like the Gilets jaunes, who object to the higher price of diesel fuel. So there's a problem about, how do we make all these differences and how do we balance the different interests? And this is where small scale experiments come in. So, if we think about not simply, well, we're going to spend small amounts of money, but how do we actually think about how we spend small amounts of money in a strategic way to deliver experiments that can prefigure these larger transformations? So how do we think about engaging with specifics of activities and places? How do we think about the process of learning? How do we think about upscaling? And that really gets me to the Challenge Fund. So we need to think about, how does the Challenge Fund fit into all of this, both as a political intervention in sort of the world of the foundational economy, and also in terms of how do we think about meeting some of these objectives that we all have. So apologies if everybody knows a lot about the Challenge Fund, but what we've seen here is a very interesting experiment around social innovation. So I think everybody's very welcoming of the Challenge Fund. It's had quite a widespread effect in terms of the numbers of projects funded. So 52 projects, on average about £100,000 each. This is partly possible because the initial funding pot was expanded. So it's been possible to allocate funds across different regions, different activities, different kinds of applicant. Inevitably, COVID-19 will have had an effect, particularly in relation to setting up communities of practice. So that was part of the original plans, was not simply to hand out pots of money in an isolated way, but to try to connect up these projects so that there was much more potential for learning. So interesting question is, can all of this be the basis for a new kind of networked social innovation? I mean, we know social innovation can happen, but can we do it at a wider scale and in a more sort of smarter networked way? Clearly, one of the dangers is this horrible thing, pilotitis. So the money goes in and then the activity stops when the money stops, and people move on because they need to do something else. And everything, a lot of the innovation and the learning gets lost. So we need to think about, how do we network social innovation? How do we think about the challenges? How do we think about capturing what's worked? How do we think about connecting up things and people so that more can happen, more can follow on rather than the learning getting lost? And the accent clearly needs to remain on this idea of challenge. It needs to be about doing something different, not simply, well, here's another grant to do something that you want to do. But how do we, how do we use the opportunity to kind of to challenge ourselves in terms of what is it possible to do? How can we learn? How can we connect? So if you look at the projects and the opportunities that are here, some of the projects are activity focused. So some of them are focused on things like care or food or procurement. Some of them are place-based. So for example, Cwmni Bro in Blaen y Festiniog or the Skyline project in Treherbert. So we've got, there's a mix of projects. So there's an opportunity to kind of learn about activity and place-based projects. And I think this is where, my overlap with Debbie continues. I think it's really important to think about the idea of places, because we all live in places, and places is where, all these activities and systems kind of come together. So the way we experience housing and transport and healthcare is very much mediated through the places that we live. And the things that are often important to us are the things that are immediately around us, like our parks and our high streets, as Debbie indicated. And our places also give us some understanding of the problems we have. So we don't simply have a problem of decarbonisation in an abstract sense. We've got a problem about what do you do in particular places. So another project myself and colleagues are working on is looking at 3 Welsh towns, Bridgend, Bangor and Haverfordwest. I'm sort of thinking about the extent to which we have things like not only car dependence, but also multiple segregated communities. So you have lots of people kind of moving in and out, but people living in different places and people not connecting with each other's. So we've got, not only these very general abstract problems, we've got very specific place-based issues where we need to kind of think through what's it possible to do. So I think if there's to be another fund, and that would be interesting to think about, then maybe we might think more about kind of communities and connections. So how do we join this fund up with other things? How do we connect, foundational economy challenge funds with different kinds of planning, different kinds of ideas? How do we add in bridging activities and other things that might help to do this renewal and rebuilding reliance systems? So that's me. I'll stop there.
Julie, many thanks for that exemplary presentation. So many great issues there. I don't know whether we've got any questions in chat or Q&A yet, Lucy, but while people are thinking of...
I don't think so, not yet.
Then I'll ask a quick one while I'm waiting for someone smarter to ask a better question. Julie, you mentioned the need for small-scale prefigurative experiments and the need for experimentation because there's no grand plan, as you rightly said. But on the other hand, then, I worry then that not just in Wales, but in the UK or European Union generally, we then have policymakers and particularly auditors who are completely disconnected from this experimental mindset. So the audit and compliance system and the legal advisors that we have around us seem to be saying to us, be bold, be experimental, so long as you don't make a mistake. So there's some kind of, comical disconnect there between what we want to do and what we're allowed to do. Would you say there's something in that?
Yes, I'm sure you're right, and I think one of the challenges then about how do we have a kind of an education and kind of learning program that's not simply for kind of people leading experiments in communities, but actually for these other institutions, to kind of so that they're not simply making judgments at the end, but they're actually bought into kind of some of the ideas and some of the objectives here. So I think you're right, Kevin, and I think the problem has to be solved by kind of rethinking some of the processes. And I guess for better or worse, we no longer have to deal with the European Union level. It's more of a local level, I guess. It's the one we have to think about.
Yeah. Any more questions for Julie?
Yeah, we've got so Shay Buckland Jones. I'm going to let her talk now. So Shay.
Him. Shay, where are you?
It's actually Jess instead of Shay.
I'm sorry, Jess.
It's actually fine. It's our fault, our end. Great presentations. Thank you both. in the recent presentation, you touched on environment issues around decarbonisation, the impact of these systems on our planet, but also started to build on how we invest in our natural resources, but also using that smartly to see them as kind of investment that can be used to put back into the community. And I know Skyline project is kind of exploring that concept. I'm just wondering if there's anything that you think we can do to build that into the mainstream of thinking around foundational economy and a place-based approach. And is that through linking maybe some of the governance systems around area statements, etc., into this space? So at the moment, it feels quite, the foundational economy might not be linked into those environmental governance systems which we're looking about localization.
I think thanks Jess, that's a really good question. I think that this linking up is a really key theme, and I think the linking up has to happen in different ways. I think a linking up in Welsh government, because all governments have kind of have silos, because that's the way you organise things. But I think increasingly the problems we have are quite complex, and they do require conversations, so kind of cross conversations, but also conversations between different kinds of responsibilities. So we have things like area statements, which maybe sit outside other things. So I think one of the challenges is about how do we kind of make those connections so that people are kind of understand what's going on in other sort of processes and systems, and also things are done more effectively, so that people aren't inadvertently or otherwise getting in the way. So I think that is a really big challenge, is how do we do it? How do we open things up in ways that make people feel confident that they're not going to lose or too much autonomy, and things aren't being too massively sort of bureaucratized. But I think unless we can connect, we're not going to get the benefits of all the things that I think collectively people want to do. There's no shortage of good ideas. The problem is how to break through some of those obstacles.
Robert Chapman's got a question.
Robert Chapman has got a question. Just bear with me while I unmute him.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Robert.
Okay, it's just a very quick question, a quick thought or idea around the concept of massive small. Some years back, I met Kelvin Campbell, who is an urbanist, who coined this idea, this phrase, this concept, massive small. And it was all about effectively a collection of small projects with a wide or wider geographical distribution, but collectively that could have a massive impact. I just wondered whether there was a kind of a link there or a resonance with the foundational economy work and indeed projects.
Yes, I have to say I'm not familiar with the massive small specifically, but the idea sounds like it definitely resonates. And I think the key thing is this question about is learning and working together. So how do we know what we already know? Because we do already know so much, and there is already lots of good things that have happened and could happen. But this is a kind of it's an ongoing challenge as to how do you both understand what's worked, how do you share that knowledge, how do you break out of existing ways of doing things at a larger scale. So I think there's definitely something in that.
Okay, thanks, Julie. We'll need to move on now because Lee has arrived, and many of you will know Lee Waters, of course. Lee has a background running Sustrans Cymru, the director, the chief executive of the Institute of Welsh Affairs, for example, before he became an AM initially, and then Deputy Minister in Economy and Transport. Before you arrived, Lee, I'd referred to you as being very fortunate to have retained your job because you were too honest for your own good. And had you said what you said about us not having a plan, but truthfully saying we're building the road as we travel, so to speak, had you said that under earlier First Ministers, you may have got your P45, but fortunately, Mark Drakeford, being a former academic, took a charitable view of you speaking the truth. So I honestly don't believe that we would have had the Foundational Economy Challenge Fund were it not for Lee Waters being in post. One of the rare examples of us being able to say something about the causal connection between cause and effect. Without further ado, Lee, over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. I have not really. I'm going to chat for a bit, I think, and then perhaps we can have a discussion. I've been doing this now for almost 2 years. Like Mark Drakeford brought me into government when he became First Minister, and this I was very pleased to be able to get this agenda to get my teeth into. It's something I've been interested in since before I was elected, and when I was elected in 2016, gathered together an alliance of backbenchers, Labour backbenchers first of all, then created a cross-party alliance, and we kept chipping away at this foundational economy idea and raising it in debates and so on, and got it referenced in documents. And then it was the real leap forward was Mark Drakeford becoming First Minister and having it as part of his leadership manifesto. But then comes the tricky bit. It's all very well talking about it. It's another thing trying to do it. And one thing I think is truly exciting about the agenda, it is genuinely an idea that has emerged from civil society, and the people you've had presenting today have all played essential roles in the building of this movement. I'm particularly indebted to the work that Julie and her colleagues in Manchester have done, working closely with Kevin and Ian and others in Cardiff. Debbie is one of the first people to sort of pick this up from a housing sector point of view and putting some critical early funding in to try and get some work in Morriston and Swansea High Street to show what this meant in tangible terms. So I think it really is an alliance for change, one of the phrase that Carol Williams likes, and I think it's a very powerful idea. So I've been trying to do my bit as part of the alliance in government for the last 23 and a half months, and it's bloody hard and frustrating. Is my first observation, so I just reflect honestly, really, about some of the challenges we've faced and continue to face, but also the opportunity that there is for us to move this on to the next phase. So and this is where in that speech that Kevin referred to that got me into trouble. When you actually read the full article that Martin Shipton wrote, it was a very fair article of a speech I'd given, but inevitably, when you speak without notes, you say I do anyway, say stuff that comes into your head, and it's not always the most elegant of phrases. There's a truth to them, but they're just not as finessed as they might be. And the two things I said that got me into trouble was one, that we were making it up as we went along, and that we didn't really know what we were doing on the economy. And obviously what I meant by that, and what I said, which was reported fairly in the whole article, is that the point about this project, this is an alternative economic strategy, to use the language of the 1980s. There is not a blueprint for how this works perfectly in practice. So in that sense, as Kevin likes to tell me, to use the Basque phrase, we are laying 1 mile of a road at the time. Much more elegant way of putting it. But we are experimenting, we are feeling our way, we are trialing, we are failing, we are learning, we are iterating. I think that is a really important, it's clearly politically complex to get these messages across, because it immediately invites the suggestion you're repudiating what's come before you, or you're admitting to having screwed it up or having no idea. And certainly, I'd regularly get this thrown back at me on social media, or rather tiresome. But, in the way it's meant, it's about accepting we live in a highly unpredictable world. And I was saying this a year before COVID, and I was saying it, as indeed was everybody else on the panel, before Brexit. And these things came along and have proven the point. There's no point saying we can have a 5-year plan, because in the age of automation and pandemic and anti-globalization, we are fighting crosswinds all the time. So let's be honest about the fact that we are where we are, but it's an opportunity to try and do something different. So in that sense, we are making it up as we go along, and we don't have a plan and have never really had a plan. anybody. I don't think any government can truly say to be in control of the economy, but politicians, peddle in the illusion that they do. And I just think it's time for us to say we are where we are in Wales. Our economic development record is clear to see. It's not working. Let's try something different. But in doing that, it's a problematic journey because we don't have a route map. So I sort of I was feeling my way through it as we developed, and in the conversations we set up Debbie as chairing a subgroup of the Welsh Government's economic ministerial panel for us on the foundational economy, and we meet regularly and we have candid, open conversations where I'm very keen for challenge and for us all addressing these problems together, and that has been a really important way of us working through this. And I'm very honest with them, and they they respect that, and we work together in that spirit of co-production. And similarly with the other people on the call who've been so important in setting the foundations for this. So what emerged really were three different strands to it. One is the experimental, and we had the challenge fund, originally a result of a Plaid Cymru budget deal where £1.5 million was agreed. I was able to get that up to £4.5 million, so we've now had 52 projects funded through that, but a number of them, 6 of them have closed because of COVID, couldn't deliver, and some of the others have had to reframe. So there was an experimental strand, then there was a spreading and scaling of existing good practice strand, and then there was a building a missing middle, supporting grounded firms strand. So those are the 3 pillars of the approach of the foundational economy in the Welsh Government. So the experimental one, you've heard quite a bit about. I think the fundamental problem we've had with the experimental one is just both the mindset and the capacity within government to be able to manage experimental projects. In a sense, we had too many, we had 52. And the way the government set about doing it was on a grant management basis. And this is how government deals with funding it gives. So it sets it up, it does quarterly reports, it has metrics, and off you go. And of course, the whole point of this approach was it was going, quite a lot of them were going to fail. And we said from the beginning, that's fine. You fail away, as long as we understand why you're failing and we can apply those lessons. That's, that is not futile, that is learning in action. But in order to do that properly, you need to be able to have the relationship management in place, that you're keeping an eye on it. And because of the procurement, we couldn't get the community of practice in place for about a year after the project's I think that's right. There was certainly quite a significant lag to the project starting and the community of practice being put in place. So that was a frustration. But we're getting there now, and the community of practice is starting to get into its stride. We've separately had review panels. One Kevin's been involved in on the 12 procurement projects, and they've given them a good kicking, which I think is very helpful. And a similar exercise on the projects involving social care. Similarly, I think about 10 of them. And again, we've had some really helpful. Jane Lynch from Cardiff University has led that panel, and we've had some really good sort of analysis and feedback on that. So now we need to learn the lessons from that and apply it. There are some quite wacky projects in the challenge funds. So the one I particularly like is Celyn, the alternative currency for Wales, based on the Sardinian model, using the people in Sardinia to help design ours. Not that wacky, it's worked in Sardinia, but pretty wacky in a Welsh context. I think it's really important that we try and push the envelope, and there are others far more mundane and far less exciting, but are useful. So how do we create procurement change for getting more local builders or handymen onto the books of council contracts, for example? So there's a real mix then. If you look on the Business Wales website and the Foundational Economy Challenge Fund, you'll see a list of the projects we funded, give you a taste of the variety. Now, the key for me is with experimenting is Kevin's old line about best practice being a poor traveller and leader and laggard living cheek by jowl. That's absolutely right, and I see this as an opportunity for trying to address that. The spreading and scaling element is trying to take good practice and trying to say adopt or justify, and we chose to try and do that through the PSB network, because under the Future Generations Act we have these public service boards. They have duties to create well-being plans, and this is exactly on point for what they should be doing. So in each place, get them to confront their role in adopt or justify best practice spreading. Now, COVID really did cause real problems here, because inevitably, as soon as the pandemic hit, everybody involved was into firefighting, quite rightly and understandably. So that hasn't helped. We decided to use procurement as the first test case to try and spread and scale, because from Preston and elsewhere, and in the Welsh case, for more than 10 years of the can-do toolkit approach in housing, there's plenty of evidence to show what works, but we need to get that taken up. So Claire's the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, who did the work in Preston and in Manchester and elsewhere, won the contract to work with us on the analysis with the public service boards. We've got, I think, 6 clusters of public service boards now working with us, the whole Gwent cluster, the Cwmtaf cluster, the who else? There's Carmarthenshire, Pembrokeshire, and Powys as a grouping. There's still some uncertainty about who's making up the North Wales one, and I think there may be one other. So they're working with us. Claire's is working routinely with them now, doing the spend analysis of where the money in the public sector is spent, then doing a void analysis of where is the money leaking out, and how can we plug that gap. So they've already identified construction, for example, as an area that we should be focusing on, of where there being is leakage of money from Wales. Food, really important one, and we've got an experimental project in Carmarthenshire that Kevin's involved with. The public service board there is trying to get local food and local plates. They tell me the best place to grow carrots in all of Britain is in North Carmarthenshire. But do Carmarthenshire schools serve North Carmarthenshire carrots? Do they hell us like? So how do we change that? And that's what we're working through with Carmarthenshire and making some progress. But then we've done the spend analysis of the whole of the NHS in Wales, which has found that 51% of NHS food spending is in Wales, 49% is outside of Wales. So huge potential there, because when you look at all the categories of spend, in every single case, there is an alternative Welsh supplier. So we are spending £1 million on crustaceans and molluscs and something else to an English firm, when there are alternative providers of that in Wales. And even amongst that 51%, it's a postcode procurement figure, so it's misleading. So Castell Howell, for example, in my patch in Cross Hands, big supplier to the NHS, but only about 10% of their suppliers are Welsh. So that counts as part of the 51% spend, but of course it's not the whole story. So we're working with Castell Howell to how can they get more Welsh suppliers on their books, what are the barriers? And this, for me, this is where we're at now. So to give you the real live update, is that we saw PPE as an example of. So I use this to tell the story. So I was involved in PPE supply during the pandemic, and we were finding, like everybody else, the global long supply chain was very fragile and it crumbled at the first touch of stress. So though it was cheap, it was not resilient. And for well-being critical services, as Carol and Julie would call them, then you need resilience. So what we decided to do was to try and get as much as possible. Obviously, our first priority was to get stocks, and we did well in Wales. We didn't run out of stocks at all. Touch and go sometimes, but we pulled it off. And that's because of a planned procurement system, by the way, an integrated one. That's another story. I'm happy to come back to that, but I won't divert myself. But we tried to get Welsh firms to step into that gap, so we were providing Welsh homegrown PPE. Now that is proven to be extremely challenging, and this for me is where we really now need to get into the weeds of it within government, because we've got to reassemble these supply chains. And when you think about PPE as an example, so first of all, you've got a challenge around procurement policy. Is it okay to direct procurement policy away from best value, lowest cost, to say we are actively going to buy Welsh goods? Is that a problem? So discuss. Okay, there are varying views in the procurement community about that, but we want to say yes, it is okay. That's an active government objective. So we're going to do that. Box 1 ticked. Then there's the issue of cost. Now, clearly, in the height of the pandemic, the prices for PPE went through the roof. So it's not a typical example, but it did mean that Welsh firms could be competitive. In normal times, we would struggle to cope with mass-produced Chinese masks and be competitive, but in pandemic times we could. So there's a question of, can we get Welsh spend from existing spend, or do we have to spend more? Now, what Preston said to me was they were able to get their spend up from something like 8% local procurement to, I forget now, 40%, something like that, quickly, without spending more, and they found it easier than they expected. So is it a case of spending what we already spend, but spending in a different way, or is it a case of spending more? Now, Liz Lucas and Caerphilly has done the brilliant example of where they've agreed to spend a penny more per pint of milk in Caerphilly, so they get local milk for local kids. But that involves spending a little bit more to get a larger social value. So that's something we are currently wrestling with. Is it the case, as I say, of spending what we already spend differently, or is it the case of spending a little bit more to get a lot more social value? Or is it a bit of both? So we're currently working through that. So that was the third example that came out of PPE. And then the other one is the standard setting. So in PPE, you can't just produce a mask. You know, we brother engineer in Pontardawe were pretty quickly able to turn their widgets around to producing masks. But you can't simply provide masks into NHS, especially in the middle of a pandemic, that don't comply with standards. Now, do brother engineering know how to go through medical research standards? No, they don't. So there's a support role then for Welsh Government and the testing agencies that we have to work with them to take them through that, to get them up to it, and they're now up to it, and they are now able to sell into the NHS. But then it comes back to the price point. Then I think finally for me is the demand stimulation. So food's a really good example of this. When I was meeting with Castell Powell recently about this, they were making the point was, well, you know, we could do all those things. We could get Welsh lamb, selling it to schools, but the catering managers won't buy Welsh lamb because the kids won't eat Welsh lamb. They turn their nose up at it. Now, there's been lots of different work on recipe cards and so on. How can we get recipes that Welsh school kids will eat using locally sourced food? Now, this going back to the Challenge Fund, we have a Challenge Fund project up in Bethesda, I think, called with Moan Shellfish, who at the moment, you know, a lot of our shellfish is sent to Belgium and France and Portugal and so on. Very little of it consumed locally. So how can we get local foods and local families consuming locally produced products? So that's what that Challenge Fund project is doing, is working with them to try and understand that, to try and do it. So if we're going to do more, if we need to do more of that for Welsh schools, we probably need to do is the demand stimulation as well. So we've got all those things. And I guess the bit I've missed there, back to give that brother engineering example. So say we were to get 20% of all spend in NHS Wales on PPE, which is our current working target. Can we get Welsh firms into that gap? We had this conversation with the Director of Finance of Powell, who's done some great work during the pandemic, but he was making the point that he is not plugged into the economic development function. So if he is able to free up X% of health board spend for local procurement, how can he be sure, and how does he know the local producers can step into that? So that's where Welsh Government really needs to come in, because, you know, we do have an economic development function, as do some local authorities. We need then to be lining that up. So we are working with local producers, manufacturers, to make sure that they can do all the things necessary around standards and price and so on. So that's, I think, what we really need to achieve is that pipeline of problem solving. And at each point, we break down the barriers, we interrogate the barriers, we overcome the barriers. And in each of those areas I identified, that's exactly what we need to be doing. And then just to go back then to so that was the second strand, the spreading and scaling. And then the third strand then feeds into that is the supporting grounded firms, building a missing middle. And that's where that job of Welsh Government coming in and stitching together the supply lines and rebuilding Welsh manufacturing base is so important. So it's bloody complicated, and it's especially complicated in a siloed system. It's even more complicated in a siloed system in a pandemic. But that is the task at hand, and that's what we're working on. And I am working closely with the civil service on this to try and get them to be able to tackle this problem in this way. And it's work in progress, I think, is the honest report back to that. But I think the prize is there, and I'll finish on this. You know, if we get this right, we are heading into the worst economic slump in 300 years. We have a budget settlement for the next financial year that is uncomfortable. So once you take out the extra money we've had, once you assume NHS has a similar uplift in Wales as it does in England, I think we've got something like 60 million to play with for the whole government across everything of additional funding. and the demands are huge. I've just been in a meeting with bus operators who this year we've given 140 million to this year, just for bus operators. So that just gives you a sense of the scale of the funding challenge we have and the amount of resource that we have available. So it's even more important that we use the money we already spend through public procurement to better effect, to bring about economic benefits and well-being benefits, and restoring the sense of place. This is where it comes from for me. I went into politics because, and I've based my career on doing things that make a difference to the sort of communities I came from. I was told in Ammanford when I was 16, if you want to get on, you want to get out. And I did. I didn't go far, went 60 miles, but everybody did. And the Amman Valley is never going to get any better if that keeps happening. And right across Wales, we're never going to get better if that keeps happening. And this agenda for me is about just that. It's about replenishing and nourishing our communities to give them a sense of economic and social purpose that can address some of the shortcomings that have led people into the arms of Brexit and other forces of anger. Diolch.
Presentation.
You've turned into Metal Mickey on my.
You have, Kevin.
Yeah.
Your signal's gone quite bad. Thank you for that, Lee. Have you got a better signal, Kevin? Let's turn on.
No, perhaps you should log off and log back in, Kevin.
Yeah, maybe try log off and log back in, Kevin. I'll do the questions for now, if that's okay, Lee. So a couple of people have put questions in the comments box. One lady called Kate McCormack, and she apologises for her long-winded question, but she needs to give some context. She says, I work on one of the care-related projects that has been badly affected by COVID, because when talking to the community about care requirements, you need to build trust, which is difficult online. Also, people only tend to want to engage at the point of crisis, which is again difficult when we've no services to offer until the community has helped us to design new ones. Chicken and egg. Anyway, we've ploughed on and are finally making headway just as funding is finishing. And here's the question. Given this, plus the fact that services have been removed or ongoing eligibility barriers being raised because of COVID, shouldn't Welsh Government ensure that funding continues to ensure communities have an opportunity to start solutions for themselves, having in reality only just started?
Okay, and if I may, Lucy, would it be okay for the other panelists to jump in and take part in this conversation?
Yes, Julie has already responded to that, but yes, by all means, if
okay, so
they want to unmute themselves, that's perfect.
So I guess the honest answer to that question is that we set this up as experimental, not as 50 projects we're going to keep funding forever. So they were set up explicitly and clearly under those terms, and they were set up to prove themselves and to prove either we would learn from their struggles, or they would be so successful that it would be a no-brainer to scale them. And I think we need to be quite brutal about this, because there is, the tendency to try and just keep giving people money because they're trying to do a good thing, and we're just not in that position. So I think we need to be quite hard-headed about it. That said, clearly, COVID has been a significant disruptor and has stymied the ability of many to achieve their potential. And some we're already knocking on the head for that reason. Some, remarkably, have applied for our money, taken our money, and now aren't communicating with us. So I know Kevin has had the experience on the review panel where some just aren't responding to emails, which is quite extraordinary, or have gone off and funded business as usual. So some of the projects are failures and are not doing what we expected of them. But this goes back to the community of practice. If you are having problems, we need to understand what the problems are, because the chances are those are not problems you're having alone. Those are systemic problems, and they need to understand them in order to fix them. So I can't promise ongoing funding beyond end of March, because there's an election. It depends on the result. We will have money in the budget next financial year, when the budget is announced, to scale some of the projects and to implement some of the results of the CLES work. had a meeting this morning on the budget. I've been fighting hard to try and get some resource. We've got some, but you know, I think that's the best answer I can give. Does Kevin want to? He's involved in this?
Is that better?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Much better. Thanks, Kevin.
Debbie, did you want to comment, or Julie? Julie, are you still there?
Julie did comment in chat. So,
well, I was out of action when the question was asked, so I've no idea what the question was. Sorry.
I think we probably covered it off.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Let's move on then.
okay. So,
Could I ask, Lucy, if any other panelists have anything they want to challenge or add to what I said in mine?
certainly.
I'd be interested in Julie's sort of critique. I'd be keen to hear.
I wasn't planning to respond, Lee, because I thought I've already talked enough already, so I was going to let the audience come in and say something. I mean, it was good to have your update and your sort of sense of where we're up to, but I hadn't sort of prepared a response, so I'll sit it out for now if that's okay.
It's a copper, Julie. I want you to tell me where we're going wrong.
How long have you got?
32 minutes.
Okay.
All I wanted to say, one of the things I wanted to say about Lee's presentation was the example of, you know, we're all obsessed with the lack of budgets in Wales and how we haven't got enough resources. But one of the implications of Lee's presentation was that even where we have got resources, or whether it's on procurement or supply chain development, we can't get the best value out of that spend, what we have, because the firms at present are not tooled up to supply the kind of demand that we have. Would that be fair, Lee? That you've struggled like hell to try to plug those supply chain gaps, and there are problems both on the supply side and on the demand side, because in the NHS especially, there's still a low-cost procurement sourcing culture.
Yeah, yes, there is, and there's and there's good reason for it. They need to maximise the benefit of the public spending so they can free it up for frontline healthcare. Is the argument, which is a superficially understandable argument, but I think misses the point really, and that's what we're working through. And to be fair, the NHS are responding and they are embracing it. So I spoke to the NHS Finance Academy over the summer, and there's now a real sense of energy coming out of the NHS to try and engage with and respond to this agenda, which is the first time I've really felt that. These things take a long time to change. It's about, it is about culture, and it is about leadership and permission a lot of the time. And that's, 2 years isn't very long. And also bear in mind, I'm a deputy minister in a hierarchical system. So, I certainly have a persistence and some impact, but it's sometimes despite, not because. And that's not a criticism of anybody. That's just the nature of the way the culture of government works. So I think, I'm naturally pessimistic, but I do think we are getting there. But I do think politically there's now an imperative to show real tangible outcomes before May, not just because I'm facing re-election, but because I think the agenda's got to prove its worth to whoever comes next as a Welsh government. Because we've talked quite a bit about it for 2 years, and we haven't got a massive amount to show for it yet. And there's a real danger. People who are a bit sneering about it in the first place just turn around and say, "Oh, there we see, you'd done it all before. Look at that for a game of soldiers." So I think there's a real now imperative that we are able to do quick wins in the next 3 months to show that there's something to this.
We've got a question from Ian, I think is addressed to Lee, about the relationship between knowledge economy and foundational economy, and what is the scope for using, digital technologies, among other things, within the foundational economy sectors.
Well, this was among the first arguments I had with Carol, and there've been a number of them. And I mean, in the best spirit, I'm a big fan of Carol, but we have sometimes a sort of slightly vinegarish relationship on these issues, because I thought the foundational economy was just far too Luddite, really, in its early iterations, and it was very sniffy about tech, and I can understand why. But I thought it was just a false dichotomy, really. And I think when I think of some of the objections to the foundational economy you hear amongst orthodox thinking, and it's Welsh economy's got a productivity problem, it's got a skills problem, it's got a wage problem. Foundational economy simply compounds those. It doesn't address them. That's the standard point of view, and I think that's wrong. And I think and this is one of the things I struggle with, again, with the government machine. They'll often say, well, this is in the foundational economy. We're supporting construction. That's in the foundational economy. Therefore, we're supporting the foundational economy. And I want to scream. Because that's not what the foundational economy agenda is about. The foundational economy agenda is about disrupting the way the foundational economy works. To raise its profile and stand its value, but change it. We don't want to reinforce low skill, low wage, lack of fair work agenda. We want to turn it on its head. And I think, technology and AI and so on are a really important part of getting them applied to the foundational sectors to change the way the foundational sectors work. So it's not in opposition to it. Oh, good. Julie wants to come in.
Yeah, I was going to agree with Lee. I think that there isn't such a divide between knowledge economy and foundation economy. And I think one of the things we've learned in COVID-19 is the value of digital technologies for connection. So whilst they can be hugely exploitative and they're the source of lots of undermining of fair work, I think they also have huge potential to connect people up within communities and across communities. So you think about how many small businesses have been able to use online services to kind of carry on providing food or whatever it is in local communities. I think we need to learn how we can use technologies a lot more in some key foundational areas. So I think there's loads of potential there for kind of using technology.
And if there's one from Shay.
Do you want me to read that one out, Kevin?
Please.
So Shay has asked, what is your vision or hope for moving foundational economy from experimental to main or equal approach to economy in Wales?
Well, I thought that was what my whole presentation was about, really. We are about to publish our economic reconstruction plan, and I'm pleased to say that the foundational economy, we identified 5 beacons, and the foundational economy is beacon number 1. So mainstreaming this into what we do is my objective, and not being seen as some quirky little project that is on the margins. And that's really what the process I described is about. If we can get into the guts of the finance departments across the public sector and say to them, this is business, this is the new normal business as usual model we expect from you. Similarly, if we can get into the mainstream economic development target and saying, look, if they're spending this money in Welsh economy, you need to be there supporting local grounded firms to take up that business and stop worrying about chasing the latest wonderkind from away. Which is still very much in the DNA. That search for the quick fix. We've been doing it for 50 years, and it's hard to move away from. And I think the hard yards of working to build small, capable firms to fill these supply voids is unglamorous, and it's frustrating. But I think that's where the economic prize is. So shifting the thinking in all of these areas so they become what we do is the task at hand, I think.
Lee, before you arrived, we were talking about the capacity constraints throughout Wales on the part of every organisation, in terms of limited budgets, organisational capacity problems, all of which have been compounded, of course, by Brexit first and then by COVID. This is a familiar story for us all. And one of the ways to address that, or to mitigate it at least, is to move in the direction of much more co-production, where we're working in concert to each other. But there's a feeling sometimes by, whether it's in the private sector, other public bodies, that Welsh Government is still locked in to a somewhat hierarchical way of working. Is it fanciful or romantic to think that it's possible to change that political culture?
I don't think it's unique to Welsh Government, Kevin. I think it's government. And I think that's both central and local. I think it's the culture of government. And I think, to be fair to government, they too have capacity problems. We've seen the loss of something like 1,800 civil servants since austerity that haven't been replaced. And one of the problems we're facing in implementing this is just the bodies just aren't there in the way that they were 10 years ago, and that is a real issue. The capacity is definitely an issue, and the move to regional working and the creation of the corporate joint committees next spring that Julie James has been leading is an opportunity to redress this. In my heart of hearts, I think this is fundamentally about leadership, and it's about what you've talked about, this culture of adopt or justify, or as I would have put it, an intolerance of mediocrity. That's what I think we need, because even within highly constrained the environment you described, you still have the Liz Lucases of this world, who is in the middle of all this, still able to do this stuff. Now, there's no doubt that the public service across the board is under strain, and you've seen through COVID how magnificent public servants have been to step up to the mark. So let us not demonize councils, government, public service. They absolutely can put their shoulder to the wheel and sort out problems when they have a clear problem to solve. And I think there's a job of leadership here, and I mean this, and this is back to this alliance of change idea. This isn't the hero leadership of a single figurehead. This is about system leadership to drive through these changes. So I think there's an imperative, given the economic calamity we're heading into, to do that, and it's doable.
Any other questions coming through?
So Alexandru has asked, what can we do to increase acceptance for innovation, experimentation, and possible failure?
Can somebody else answer this? I'm fed up with the sound of my own voice.
I think it's a lot easier to do that outside of government than in government. I think we've all said, Lee's a beacon in terms of leading on something that's tricky, and it will be easy not to try it at all because it's difficult to deliver results in the short term. And I think we've already said that government is bestrewn with internal auditors coming along trying to tell you that you haven't got clear enough targets, or you haven't analysed the risk properly, or blah, 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 which isn't really true when you get into less governmental organisations. So there is maybe something, and I don't know how easy it is to do, about if you're able to use intermediary bodies actually to give out money, and it's not all about giving out money, but when it comes to the money, actually, if you can outsource the risk and kind of potentially, I think Welsh Government's got an issue in terms of trying to do policy and delivery. And sometimes if you've got clarity of policy and somebody else does the delivery, then you're also outsourcing the risk. And I hesitate to say WDA because I'm not saying we want to recreate the WDA, but what that model did was mean that you had an agency in the sense that was at the front end that was less exposed to public scrutiny or media scrutiny than Welsh Government is themselves. But I think it also requires a maturity on the part of the Welsh citizens to accept that if you want change, actually you're going to see things that are risky and things that fail, and the value is in the learning, which I guess is around some of the lessons we're trying to draw from the Challenge Fund projects themselves.
Can I also add to that and relieve Lee's voice in the sense of just shifting the focus, from Welsh Government to the other institutions that can play and should be playing a big role in foundational economy. I've just been reflecting over the last few months because I've had to get involved in a field which which I still don't know very much about, which is social prescribing. And there are some people who are experts in this field, trying to find nature-based solutions to problems like mental health, which have been way, way, way over-medicalized up until now. And just trying to put our researchers together with community groups on the one hand, fantastic community groups like ACE in Cardiff, Grow Cardiff, and another one, Cannon Valley Organic Adventures. All these community groups that we've begun to have discussions with have been saying the same thing, that they're expected to develop a more robust evidence base to show the impact of these nature-based solutions. And that's where universities can play a role. But two of the big problems, as I understand in social prescribing, is that professionals tend not to respect community knowledge, whether that's academics on the one hand, not recognizing the knowledge outside the academy, or whether it's doctors not recognizing any knowledge that is not credentialized in terms of the medical establishment. And therefore, it's a steep learning curve for everyone involved in social prescribing, where literally we've all got something to add. And I found it chastening and humbling, actually, to listen to community groups who are working with very deprived communities on trying to get new forms of treatment and health promoting treatment, other than just tablets and pills, for example. So that's been a big learning experience for me, because universities tend not to be able to be equipped to engage in unfamiliar ways. And the same goes for the NHS, in my opinion. But there are chinks of light. And by working together, I think we can get ahead together.
That's one of the concepts I really like from the community wealth building movement. And I've been really frustrated by this People's Front of Judea distinctions that are made between foundational economy and community wealth building. Because, yes, okay, there are some subtle academic distinctions, but they're much of a muchness, really. But I think this concept of anchor institutions is really important. And it's about the universities and the NHS and the FE colleges recognizing their responsibility to their areas. And I think that penny dropping is a really important first step.
Any further questions, Lucy?
Robert Chapman has actually put two questions in. They're quite long ones. Robert, I'm going to see if Robert wants to unmute so that he can actually vocalize them himself. Whether he responds.
I can do if you wish. I was referencing a piece of research that Julie mentioned earlier on, Serious About Green. And basically, this was a piece of research commissioned by Wood Knowledge Wales, which was to investigate the afforestation of the appropriate parts of Wales for wood production. And whilst not a template, ERA was offered as a suggested parallel, if you like, whereby they've, since the 70s, doubled the area which was afforested. And now 40% of that grown timber, which has value, goes into construction. And so I was posing the question, and maybe this is one for Lee, do you think such a project has legs in Wales, mindful of topography?
So one of the opportunities that's come out from some of the projects failing in the Challenge Fund through COVID is that it's freed up some money to redirect. And I'm afraid I've not gone through the competitive process, but chosen to myself. And one is Wood Forest Wales, so giving them funding to do an analysis by the end of March of what it would take to change the place of the industry and the supply chain, so we can use Welsh timber for precision engineering, high value products to build houses rather than using it for pallets and garden furniture. So that's, I think, a really exciting project, and they are working at pace on that now. And then the second one I've awarded it to is around horticulture production, and especially around controlled environmental agriculture, so using sort of hydroponics and non-traditional approaches, which I think has got significant opportunity, particularly as we come out of the European Union, where we can start to produce far more of our own salads and vegetables and so on, and in the valleys. I think there's real potential. So we've funded 3 projects with them from memory: one in Wrexham, one in Torfaen, and one in Cynon Valley, I think. So I do think that that wood and food are an important part of the foundational economy mix too, not just focus on procurement.
On the basis that I'm still unmuted, and on the back of that very last sentence from Lee, I'll go on to ask my second question then. I am aware of this project, but the growing of malt barley in West Wales, you might guffaw at that point because it's not well known and it's not typical practice, generally grown in the southeast of England, dare I say. But I can tell you that Welsh malt barley has been grown in West Wales this year to support the creation of a Welsh origin whisky. In other words, a Welsh whisky made from Welsh malt barley. Now, that was the catalyst for engaging with local farmers to produce malt barley. And the instigator of that has suggested a wider idea, which could have a wider impact on Wales, which is this. Could a wider collection of farmers, and we rely on farmers to produce food, could a wider number of farmers to support their incomes and resilience and all that sort of thing, be encouraged, subject to demand, to grow Welsh malt barley, which beyond the project that I've just described, could support a wider range of food and drink businesses in Wales. Why? Well, because it's Welsh malt barley. It has origin. It has a geographical authenticity. And is that something that could be supported from a foundational economy point of view?
So I think the principle is the same. This is the supply void analysis, isn't it? Let's do an analysis of what we're spending our money on and how much of that are we spending it outside of Wales and how much of that could we reshore. And that, that applies as much to malt barley as it does to anything else. And, that applies to everyday low value goods and high value goods. So one of the pieces of work we're currently looking at, James Davis, who's chair of Industry Wales and is excellent, and we're very, very lucky to have him in the Welsh Government. He was a former European chair of Calsonic Kansai, based in Japan, from Neath originally, still in Neath. And he and Mike Evans of EBS Automotive in Llanelli have come up with an analysis showing the amount of money we're spending on high value goods. We tell ourselves that it's Chinese stuff we're buying, and we're not generally getting stuff from high cost economies, but actually we are. Look at the stuff we're buying in the NHS. It's from Canada and from Germany, and it's expensive stuff. And how much of that, with proper sort of intervention and planning, could be making Wales? So when you look at the table, we import hip joints, eye sockets, dentures, medical devices. There's no reason why, with the right sort of industrial intervention and lead-in time, we couldn't be producing far more of those in Wales. So I think the agenda, the principle is the same, isn't it? And that's what I think we're just whetting the appetite and seeing what's possible.
We've got time for, there's 2 last questions waiting there, Lucy. One from Igor and one from David Beale. And then we could wrap up on those.
Okay, so do you want to read them or shall I? I'll read them. Okay, so Igor has said, interesting question on digital technologies. How to overcome I can't even pronounce that, extravagantist, solutionist. Bear with me, sorry, someone was calling me.
I think he meant extractivist solutions.
Extractivist, solutionist, exploitative data, AI, smart policy agenda by empowering platform, data cooperatives in Wales and beyond from the foundational economy perspectives. Is there any critical mass for achieving this so far? Stakeholders and active agents out there? Whew.
That sounds like a research project. I suspect Igor may have the answer to that better than us on the panel. I mean, there is a lot of interest in platform and data cooperatives. I don't know, there may be some in Wales. It's not really my area, but I think this is this reflects a comment in the chat as somewhere else I've just seen about, is this only in Wales? I think there's lots of scope for doing these things and learning from what's going on in other places. So platform cooperatives have been much bigger in some of the European countries, and I think there's lots of scope for kind of taking some of that learning back and doing it in a sort of Wales specific context. So I can't say any more than that about that question.
So I'm really excited about the potential of precision agriculture and agri-tech precisely for this reason. So traditionally, precision agriculture is seen about being on-farm production. Can we grow this bit of barley faster using less chemicals if we use drones? To caricature the point. So that's a really exciting area in itself, and we have some research going on in Wales on that. But the real prize is, as precision agriculture gains traction, and we're putting sensors everywhere. If you buy a tractor now from JCB, JCB will retune the tractor for you remotely and send you an invoice, because it's gathering real-time data all the time. We're putting sensors in the ground of how crops are growing. That data is going back to China or America. It's not staying here. Now, I think the real sort of supply, the whole pipeline for us in Wales is the let's develop a precision agriculture system that works for Welsh conditions, which are not typical of the most precision agriculture stuff. Then is to the software and the data analytics and collection and harvesting here. Let's build the robotics here that we can use, and we need that whole loop thinking. And I've been banging my head on that one for a couple of years and making little bits of progress, but I think it partly answers Igor's question. I think, yes, Igor, we can, and I think precision agriculture offers a way to do that. And the second thing I'd say to your question is, yesterday we launched our new digital strategy for Wales, which I'm also responsible for. I think it's a really good document, but I didn't want us to just publish it and be pleased with ourselves. So we've put it out to crowdsourcing. We're publishing it in chapters. I think the second chapter has gone up today, and we're going to be doing that over the next couple of weeks. It's open. We're publishing full in March. But here is your chance. Here's the crowd's chance to say, you know what the hell you're talking about. Have you thought about this? This is how to make it better. So keen for you to feed in those thoughts, Igor, as part of that genuine open exercise.
Final question from David Beale, which basically David is asking, is there more scope for community ownership of some of the activities that we're talking about today? I guess that's addressed to mainly Lee and Debbie, is it?
So I think there absolutely is. Sorry, Debbie, if I just answer first, and then I'll let you have the last word. There absolutely is. I think one of the the missing middle bit, I think the employee ownership agenda is a really important part of that. How do we ramp that up quick enough is a real question. Wales Co-op tells me it takes about 10 years before you see the idea with the firm of passing it on to the employees and then being able to put that in place. So that's a longer term agenda, but we need to be doing more on it now. And then, I think the whole social value concept really needs to embed in. So Robert was mentioning the forest issue. One of the challenges we have is Natural Resources Wales and their concept of social value versus best value. And I've been having some conversations with them about the experimental project Welcome to Our Woods up in Treherbert, where there is not a meeting of minds on what is social value and what is best value. And I think that is that's a legislative interpretation point. They're saying the Forestry Act trumps the Future Generation Act, and we're working that through with them. But I think in order to fully tap that potential, that social value agenda needs to be embraced.
I was going to come in on exactly the same point about the forestry connection that Lee's made, because I think community ownership can take different forms. If we come back to the forestry theme, then I think there are really interesting ideas about how to use the Natural Resource Wales estate and to kind of, in a sense, connect that back into forestry ownership, because that's one of the ways of trying to create more value from the forestry estate that we've got, connected with the communities who live next to the forest and have no connection with it at all at the moment. And that's also a way which the Skyline project is trying to explore. of trying to also improve the commercial value of forestry. So there's so many possible wins from this, but it's a question of being able to kind of make things happen. So I think there's, if we want to end on an optimistic note, I think there's so many good ideas in Wales of things that people want to do. I think that there's the foundational economy is such a rich space for thinking about digital technology, communities, and everything else that I think, we just need to get on with it.
That's a wonderfully uplifting point, Julie, on which to send us all on our way. So, and just to conclude, other than thanking Lucy and Fiona for all the great work that they do behind the scenes to keep webinars like this on the go, can I also thank Debbie, Julie and Lee for excellent presentations and for being very full and frank in their views. And the final point I'd make before we wind up is I thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you'll all continue to engage with foundational economy activity and keep its profile high and healthy as we move into the Welsh general election in May, because these issues are central to the future well-being of Wales. And we must all wish Lee well in the election in May, because we want to continue to be engaging with him. So on behalf of us all at Cardiff University, many, many thanks to you all for joining us today. Bye for now.